Yeah, so, well, thank you, Beatrix. So maybe we start with this idea of the iterations of this exhibition, because as Beatrix said, it began a number of years ago with discussions about Haim's work, Haim's influence of his work, and also the idea of thinking through what a survey would be and how a survey might change and gain speed and differentiate itself over a period of different venues. Initially, Bard and Kunsthalle. When I first went to Haim to propose this kind of project, which was actually to try to bring the Haim Steinbach that many people in Europe knew, but who had been who remained somewhat out of people's minds in America, and how would we kind of do that? And Haim actually and Tanya Bonacta's gallery in New York came back and said, what we'd really like you to show are these paintings and the linoleum works we see downstairs, which was completely the opposite of what I was thinking we were going to do, and was kind of surprising. And these were works that actually I didn't know well. I'd seen a number of reproductions, but in a very limited capacity. And in fact, it turned out that Beatrix was incredibly enthusiastic about showing these works. So that was a kind of starting point for the exhibition. And I think maybe we start with Haim. You could tell us about the different iterations, and also in this process, what's been surprising to you about your own work?
Well, that's a mouthful of, let's see if I can be simple. So, you know, we are in the studio, we make our art, we live in a time, and things are going on, ideas. You know, a lot of the discussion in the 70s among artists and in artist journals, of course, had to do about context. Already before that, we had Malraux talking about the museum without walls. We had later on Robert Smithson bringing rocks into the gallery. You know, there was the question of identity, of role models, as the play of the work of Cindy Sherman shows. And social issues, of course, that leads to that, and context. I was navigating my way through the concepts and ideas of minimal art and conceptual art in the late 60s. And by the early 70s, I was really more directly engaging these ideas in my own work. You know, the way we think as artists, we make visual things. And that's how we think more than reading about things. We use our eyes. And so the question was clearly about location, place, object, which came out of minimal art. What is an object? How does it occupy space? How do we engage it? So if you walk into a gallery space and there's nothing there, but just some tiles on the floor in a square, you go, where's the art? But there are the tiles on the floor. And then somebody is walking across it, and that's a Carl Andre. So there's a kind of game being played here. And so by the time I did the early paintings that you see here, the question was, what is an object? What is a painting? How do we organize the space? And I decided to begin to collect and arrange these bars. So it becomes an arrangement like a game board. It's the idea of a game board, how you put things on a game board and play the game. Play chess or Clue or whatever it is. Actually, Clue is a game that's about the house where there's a murder someplace. And so you're going through the different spaces of the house and you have a floor plan. Well, the museum also has a floor plan, as does the house. Well, how do we walk through the rooms in the museum? Where is the murder happening? In the closet, in the main gallery? Where is the object? The question of the object So, of course, that's something that Judd talked about. He identified the idea of specific objects. But by the mid-70s, I asked the question of what is a specific object? I mean, any object is a specific object. This is a specific object. It's got a shape and form, material quality, it's transparent. It's not like another object, like a chair, unless it's made out of transparent plastic. But even then, it's not quite the same. So any object is a specific object. It really depends on how we learn to see it and to use it. And so that leads to my work with objects, where the arrangement of the bars are replaced by the arrangement of other objects made of other materials. And now they are arranged on a shelf. And once you do that, you say, what is a shelf? What is a social function of a shelf in a house? What is a counter? And suddenly you realize we have counters every place in the house, and we arrange things. People arrange things in different ways. And it raises the whole question of how you arrange things in a museum, what are the priorities, and so on. So that leads to my work with objects and to the idea of creating architectural spaces and questioning, again, the floor plan of the home, of the museum. Where are the walls? Where are the closets? How do you go through it when you begin to enter the space? Which is a kind of game. When you go to a museum, maybe it's a spiritual experience. Maybe it's an institutional game. You're going to learn about art, and it's organized a certain way so that you can see it. So, there.
Can I ask specifically, because we're in this room here, how did the work, and here you can clearly see you're sort of struggling with thinking through the legacies, which were then kind of almost contemporary of minimalism, but then downstairs you see kind of very clearly this transition with the linoleum inlay work, which suddenly grabs onto the vernacular, and it's quite a brutal, not repudiation, but a step beyond this work we see in this gallery. So could you talk about the linoleum and the vernacular in your work in sort of the mid-70s?
Well, the linoleum work is a transfer moment that I didn't stay with long. I could have, and there's a lot more to do with that, but other things came into play that made me move into the next act, okay? So what's happening is that you have, I talked about the painting as a specific object, as a game board. Well, but I was painting the painting. At that point, I was spraying the painting. I wasn't even using a brush except for the bars. I filled using a brush there. So what kind of object is a painting? Well, it's a surface, right? You paint it. And there I am standing on a linoleum floor, and I look at the floor and I go, well, somebody painted this floor before it was mass-produced into that material, and I'm standing on a painting. What if I put that painting on the wall? And so that's when I began to cut linoleum and put it on panels and on the wall. And I began to insert two triangles, one on the right side, one on the left side. And for me, each triangle represented another, not only another painting, or a painting inside a painting, an insert of a section of a painting or a fragment of a painting in another painting, but it also represented a culture, because linoleum is also a cultural material. It gives you the identity that you can relate to, and if it's part of your culture, you're going to buy that material for your kitchen or wherever you're going to put it. Of course, that begins to raise the question of the play between abstraction, like minimal art or reductive arrangement, to content, you know, the insertion of a culture in a culture or next to a culture. So anyway, that was really the idea. If the painting is already an object, if it is a game board, if you're arranging things on it, then again, what is an object? And that was that transitory moment between raising this question still within the parameters of the idea of being a painter, to shifting to the parameters of the world of materials and objects and things. And again, raising the question of what is a specific object. So that's the story of the linoleum.
And it's also this time, which somewhat by chance, you made your first shelf piece, which is the piece downstairs with the green green figures on right at the entrance to the gallery. Maybe you could talk about how you came to make that piece, and also why you kind of had a hiatus with shelf pieces for about 3 or 4 years after you made that.
The hiatus was about 3 years or something like that. That's also part of that transitory moment. In fact, at the same time that I was beginning to make the linoleum panels, I was collecting. My partner back then that I worked and lived with was the artist Nancy Shaver, and she was very fond of flea markets, and we went on a lot of journeys together to flea markets, and she would pick up objects that I thought were kind of silly. And it took me a little time to realize that they were much more profound, that she had a very deep understanding of what's behind these objects, and had a remarkable eye. And I began to say to myself, stupid, look at these things. What do they mean? And so one day I made this very narrow shelf out of the same wood material that you would make a frame for a stretcher for a canvas. In fact, these stretchers are made of the same 1 inch by 2 inch standard wood stock that you get in the lumber yard. And so I just took 2 of those pieces and put them at right angle, and I had a little shelf. And so I would put those little objects on it. It was just a play. It's just kind of a way, as I said, we think through our eyes first before we rationalize of what it could mean in terms of art. So in a way, I was making art, but I was still thinking about art in other terms, intellectually, but beginning to recognize something else happening. So the transition was a period in which I was shifting back between making linoleum pieces and beginning to work with objects. And I was also teaching at that time at Cornell University. I was very much involved with my teaching and exploring ideas with my students. And so one day I just stopped and really looked at one of these little shelves with the objects, and I said, this is a space that I need to work with. There's something to explore here on all these levels, on the formal, the social, the cultural, the artistic.
Sorry, in this kind of context, can I ask you a question about hierarchies, and I guess more specifically the idea of a collapse between the binaries of what kind of objects carry cultural capital in terms of objects versus images. So thinking about your title here, once again, the world is flat, you have this kind of almost like a sort of glib aphorism where the world as a spherical graphic image is collapsed into a sort of a universal plane where anything can go. The world is flat again, so we have a horizon, we have a starting point, we have a beginning. And in this sense, a kind of a horizontal plane in which things can be placed. So you have a sort of a kind of linguistic sense where there are multiple known things in play: the world, the flatness, and our relation to it as creatures moving about with gravity, and then something more kind of metaphorical, perhaps, where boundaries between objects and images can be crossed and conflated and then re-exploded again. So I guess the question, very simply, would be about how do you define a sense of hierarchy for yourself, like this idea of generating value or destroying it or totalizing it, and kind of taking things that are known, have very recognizable outlines, and then sort of reinvesting them either with a new sense of play or a new sense of friction with one another, or completely relocating them from any sense of a coded system where things are known and things can be named to a point where things become very uncanny. So this idea of the shelf as a sort of a humble starting point for positioning things, one thing on top of another thing, a lateral surface where you're literally just placing things to be seen. So it's a sort of very basic logic, but then that logic becomes very complicated when the objects that you're looking at and combining with one another, where it's very specifically about the relationship between each of those things. So it's not like this is a cereal box, this is a kettle. These things are so kind of totalized through a rigorous positioning, through the logic they have, both as universal signifiers for what they are, what we know we are, and then how you reinvest them with something else and sort of remove them. Or you're talking about, to bring it back to the older works, how you're inserting collage into linoleum, for example. So you have the known plane of the linoleum, and that's sort of muddied or made parasitic by this insertion of another material. So I guess a question about hierarchies.
Thanks, Helen. This is just you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's the crux of the problem, and I ran into a lot of trouble with that. So by the 80s, I get thrown into a band of players, and the practice is identified as simulation, Neo Geo, commodity, and all kinds of things, because the critical response tries to reestablish a hierarchy of value, and the work, in somewhat confusing, I suppose. I think the question of hierarchy is very important, because we all define a hierarchy. We need that to survive. When we decide to walk out of the door of the house in the morning, we are already playing the game of hierarchy, because we have a goal that morning to go to work, to take the train, whatever it is. Our mind and eyes focused on a plan that's already in our head. And as we go, and all these things are in front of us, we ignore or overlook so much, because we are thinking right now about the latest news in the paper as a way to pass time while we are sitting in the train to go to work. Or whatever it is that we prioritize. And any kind of prioritizing defines already what's most meaningful at the moment in our choice. So hierarchy has to do about choice. It's about selection, choosing, about a goal, having a goal in life, about meaning. What's meaningful and important? Now, when you practice as an artist, you could be a poet, you could be a writer, you could be a musician, a composer, you could be a philosopher. All these, you could be a sociologist or anthropologist. I mean, these different directions may pass through your mind as, readings that you have read and thought about. And it all gets integrated into your total way of processing and practicing, ultimately, your work. John Cage was a student of Schoenberg. Schoenberg already was radical, and he created a musical, mathematical structure for his music, which was revolutionary. Well, John Cage went for chants, which was not quite palatable to Schoenberg, so they didn't quite agree on the direction that he was taking, but he went his way. Well, what does it mean, chance? Anything that is chancy, it can be art? How do you? Well, you see, it's just a concept. If you are going to say to yourself, if a glass falls and breaks while I'm playing a string quartet, the next composition will include that possibility of something breaking the pattern. Then, of course, you are bringing a counterpoint to the whole idea of composition and experience and music and sound and all these things. But there's a way of structuring chants too, in the way that you open your way of thinking to see how that could be part of the whole musical enterprise. And then you begin to think that way, and with time you begin to understand it, and you can incorporate it into some kind of structure. It takes time before the reviewers, catch up with the structure and begin to interpret it to the audience. So the idea of any object being a specific object turns the table upside down, you could say, in a way, because then you're saying now that this glass of wine or water is as good as this Manet on the wall, or this Kandinsky on the wall, or this Carl Andre on the floor, or whatever. And I say yes, and I can see where that could be troubling. But the thing is that what gets you high, what gets you inspired, what gets you to feel like you're having a moment of eureka, of great experience and awareness is when you give something attention and begin to raise questions and then to re-experience it. And so, you know, maybe that's the beginning of an answer to your question.
So then another question where you were just talking almost in a sort of Duchampian sense of the object or object ontology and the value associated with objects and defining objects with a language to describe what they are. But what again about this sort of Duchampian idea of the anti-retinal, where artworks could be, the possibility that an artwork is something that should be sort of anti-aesthetic, that the value system of ordering it retinally is something that happens not in the eyes but in the brain. So in that kind of context, for me, your works are sort of specifically beautiful. They're gorgeous, they're graphically composed, and there is a logic to them that is a kind of one after the other thing, whether they're a rebus concoction of images and language, or whether it's a very straightforward kind of graphic pairing of colors on a flat ground like we see here. So I guess a question about a very basic question about aesthetics and the choices that you make when you are performing almost as a colorist in terms of composing sculpture, how those kind of logics and also paradoxes can come into play when you're creating or making a system or going against a system when you're making works.
I'd just like to add to that, one thing one element and fundamental element to Haim's work, which receives absolutely no critical attention whatsoever, is the shelves themselves. And clearly the shelves themselves are what give these humdrum objects this auratic quality, and the giving of the auratic quality was also, I think, something which people like Buchler and Krauss and Hal Foster picked up upon and responded very strongly to, because it became a kind of giving an auratic quality to commodities in that kind of a momentary iteration. So maybe you could talk a little, respond to Helen, but also really talk about how the shelf itself developed and what the meaning and relationship of the shelf is to the presentation of the object.
Well, first of all, the erotic quality is relative, and it's there of the beholder. It's also in the work. But the erotic quality, for me, is also in every object that Duchamp made. So for me, he was quite an eroticist. His objects are very visual and beautiful and stimulating. The assisted ready-made, the bicycle wheel, for me is an early mobile, you could say, radical invention. What makes the idea, the concept in Duchamp as being, maybe at the foreground, for one thing is that, yes, he came coming up with new concept or ideas that he defined or established in objects or in drawings, and and that was important. But each one of those works has visual qualities too, and idea qualities. Now, as far as the shelf is concerned and the erotic, again, getting back to Duchamp's famous urinal, the fountain, as he called it. Erotic, I mean, it's all there. I mean, basically, he was just telling us, if you like Jean Arp, then you have to like this urinal. And I think that's really an ultimate example of where Duchamp really is. The whole thing about his indifference, that's a great idea. I think you have to have some kind of indifference and a distance, to be able to not to totally collapse your practice into some kind of self-indulge something. Anyway, getting back to the shelf. The shelf is a concept, just like the wheel is a concept. Somebody invented the wheel, and it served us very well, And it is a beautiful object, a circle, a wheel. Well, the shelf is a rectangle, so is the table. It's another piece of geometry. In our culture and cultures, there are different kinds of shelves, and usually they have some kind of ornament or decorative aspect or formal aspect that associates itself with a cultural period. Baroque, Rococo, Modernist. I mean, look at Mies van der Rohe's tables, you know, which are like shelves. They are counters and furniture. These are just great works that are just what? Are they decorative of the functional aspect of a table or a chair or so on? I mean, this guy just a decorator. A chair is a chair. A table is a table. You know, just make one and we'll use it. No, they're more than that. So the thing about the shelf is it's a place. It's a place on which to put things. And to engage it is to ask the question of what kind of place it is and how does it relate to us socially, culturally, in the way that we interact with it. I've made all kinds of shelves. The wedge shelf that's covered with a plastic laminate, usually they call it formica. Well, formica is what? It is, you know, it's a corporate name of a material that makes it what? It makes it capitalist, right? Formica, everybody uses it for formica. People of all classes use it. It's an accessible material that has a very good function. And then it represents different cultural identities, sometimes a pattern and sometimes just a color. For you, red feels good, you know. For somebody else in another culture, I think the Germans like ochres and browns, and you find those in their hotels, a lot of browns and ochres. Rarely red and pink. But another culture, red and pink is wonderful. For the Eskimos, white. There are all kinds of whites, and there are a million of words for white. So what is a color? So these are all linguistic things, and this is how the wedge shelf, that I came up with is for me a device. And it really functions like a device. First of all the shelves are structurally based on the same angular structure. There's a 90-degree angle, a 45-degree angle, and a 50-degree angle. Whether they're tiny or big, they're all related to the same structure. The depth of the size is relative to the object. And each one is cut on the side, and there's at least one side that's not closed, so you can really see the cut, like you cut the branch of a tree and you can see what's inside the branch after the, you know, the, what do you call it? The grain or the bark, you know? Behind the bark there is something else. So you see the cross-section of the shelf. In a sense, each one of those shelves that may have one or three or four or five or six objects is a fragment of a continuum of objects that go on and on and on and on. When you have one, you're getting a fragment. Furthermore, within those, there are mathematical structures that have to do with numbers and the way we identify with numbers. When you think about couple, you may think about a relationship, right? Two people who have a relationship. When you think about a couple in terms of two objects that are produced in the same way through a mechanical system, you begin to think about number, about 2, 3, 4, 5 numerical systems. And all these issues of those relationship between object and structure go back to questions that minimal art itself raised in terms of how space is constructed and how elements are constructed. So as far as the question of, what was that word, that of the experience of the shelf as doing to the object? Aura. Auratic. The auratic is also in the eyes of the beholder. A kid walking into a gallery where I had a show, for that kid, the auratic was the Nike sneakers. And when that kid left, there were no sneakers on that shelf anymore.
There are a couple of things I've never really understood. You know, for you, it's not so much about the objects. I mean, I've tried, I think, for the past year and a half to find out from you why you choose one specific object over another. And it's a question you've somewhat evaded. I think for you, it's not so much about the objects, but about the relationship between the objects. And you said that starts with objects, but moves to displays. And then you've described this as a form of intersubjectivity. And I don't know what that means. And you've also described the displays as forms of rituals, and I don't know what that means either.
Let's see what I can focus on and remind me if I miss something. Ritual of the everyday. The everyday is very important. The everyday is, I suppose going to the museum is not exactly the everyday, but for someone who is very much interested in the field, it's a more everyday thing than for others, like a curator at the museum. That's certainly part of their everyday. The everyday has to do with getting up in the morning and brushing your teeth. Do you brush your teeth? Well, that's a ritual. You don't think about it anymore, you internalize it, it's something you do. I have a kid who's 9.5 years old. We still have to remind him to brush his teeth before he goes to bed. It still is not completely automatically accepted, that indoctrination. Once he accepts that indoctrination, he's going to do it on his own and find the logic why he thinks it's important for him to do that. I think our life is full of rituals. If you are subscribed to a symphony orchestra and you go once a month to a concert, that's something you chose. If you go to a religious institution, a temple, a church, a mosque, or to pray, that is a particular ritual. You eat breakfast. Do you have breakfast or do you start with brunch? Well, that's your ritual. You need to have that cup of coffee in the morning, right? So the ritual, all the objects that we have, there's some kind of ritual around them. And that becomes a very important question. That brings me back to the issue of Duchamp, the whole Duchampian question. Because again, one of the ideas in discussing my work from different critical perspectives is that ask Thierry Dedouv, he'll tell you this is not Duchampian work. And therefore Steinbach is a traitor. Well, is Duchamp a god? Anyway, the thing is that the ready-made is a Duchamp concept. It doesn't apply to every object and every ritual in the world. Duchamp was not interested in the ritual of the everyday. Duchamp was interested in all range of issues, but that was not a focus of his work. I think it's very different when you begin to question the array of world of objects and raise the question of specific objects in terms of every object and any object. That's a big problem. And I'm willing to accept, that if my attempt has failed, it's a risk I've been taking. But it is a little bit of a vertigo to try to at least leave a window open to look at any object at any moment and say to yourself, wait a minute, what did I just pass? I'm going to stop here. What does this mean? Why is it here? Who uses it for what? Does it relate to my ritual? What do they do every day? What do I do every day? What is this object?
Does it relate to the domestic? I mean, when you talk about ritual, you tend to then reference things we do in our houses, the quotidian, and then you think of the objects, garbage can, toilet brush, cornflakes packet. Are there a family of ideas inherent in the objects themselves?
Definitely. Now, for me anyway, but of course there are certain objects that are not domestic in that kind of sense, but it gets back to your question about subjectivity, subject-object relationship. It also comes back to the very recent philosophical discourse about speculative realism and the fact that the object has its own existence and autonomy from what we project on it, and in fact it projects on us in reverse. So subjectivity has to do with something that's really internally important to your need. To your need to survive, to your need for your relationships, to your particular need for feeling comfortable, to your particular culture, to your happiness. So subjective has to do with the way we subjectify things. You know, a box of cornflakes produced by Kellogg's is an American quote-unquote capitalist enterprise. But if you like that cornflakes and you've been eating that regularly for a long, long time for breakfast, you've internalized every aspect of it, including the design, the picture, the aesthetics of the picture, how you feel about that object. You develop a certain feeling, it becomes your teddy bear on a certain level. It becomes something that's part of your life. And that's the subjective, or the subjective end. It's not anymore a corporate capitalist object that is manipulating you. Even though speculative realism and object ontology will discuss an object as really having a certain kind of spell on you, but in that sense, it's any object. It's not just a mass-produced object. It's any object. It's anything. It's the plant. It's a molecule. It's a concept, a mathematical concept. It projects its own meaning. It already talks back to you. So, you know, I think that subjectivity has to do with not only with the way that we are subjected, but the way that we regenerate meaning by projecting our subjectivity into the objective world and challenging it. And from there on, if we have some ideas, we become aware of them.
Maybe it's a good moment to bring in Helen, because you know, you sometimes think that an artist of Helen's generation, the kind of work that Helen has been doing in the last couple of years, lives in a different ontological realm or a different world of objects. Objecthood itself is being questioned in a different way. Do you think that's true, or do you think you and Haim share certain sensitivities?
Well, I was actually going to ask Haim about his relationship to patience, and within that, I mean, we're sort of entering an age of retinal impatience where the very fabric of reality has changed because by virtue of, and very symptomatic of things like the internet and this constant image dispersion and uploading, updating, compressing images and objects have become incredibly muddled, incredibly confused. What has content, what has precedence, what has substance or materiality over one thing or another. And what I see very evidently in your work, and also I'm questioning in my work, is when you're creating an artwork, you're sort of setting up a timescale or a temperature for an audience to sort of either assert a reading or to reinterpret some kind of logic that you've asserted on it yourself. And then within that, I guess this idea of economy and when something signifies very quickly, or whether the discovering of it is a more labored or more durational process. And I think this is kind of a paradox with your shelf works, where you set up these very distinct and almost very clinical sculpture relationships, both within the work, but also within the audience relationship to the work, that we have an immediate response to something. You can name it, we can walk around it, and we can know what it is. But also the sort of discovery of these things can be either a very prolonged thing, or it is, I mean, they function both as pictograms, but also more as rebuses, where objects and images sort of set up these anagrammatic relationships to one another, where you can both take it as an immediate response, almost like a billboard or like some kind of signage, where there is kind of clarity to the information given, but also something that might have a more sort of delayed structure to it. So I guess I'm also interested in this sense, the relationship between your text works, which have a very blunt, a very graphical, black on white typography to them. The message is instantaneous, but they're also like sort of short circuit anagrams or aphorisms. So I guess, Tom, well, I guess this general question about object ontology and our relationship to what an object is, what it signifies, how it relates to us in the world and the greater structure of things and other typologies is probably I guess there are similar concerns, and I think the only thing that I would say has changed is that our retinal patients and our cognitive patients are sort of operating at very different speeds, where we've become accustomed to knowing things and feeling very casual about understanding them in terms of possessing them, or you're talking about speculative realism in the sense of how they fit into another greater theoretical structure or consumerist structure. But I think it would be, I don't know, I think there are very specific things shared, and that the one thing that perhaps we share in common is this idea that things are inherently linguistic, and that objects are sort of vessels for a further and almost unending cycle of linguistic propositions, where you have signs and signifiers, but these things are in a continual sense of confusion, where by virtue of being artists, we have the luxury to manipulate them and remanipulate them so that they're either completely totalized and hermetic, but also equally instantaneously readable. So I guess following on from this, I'm keen for you to talk about your typographic works, these sort of very deadpan, almost glib, but actually I find incredibly knotty propositions for. I mean, what are they? How do we respond to them? Are they sort of delineations of some kind of social space, as an example, as an invitation, or are they more sort of sections of a kind of greater system of poetry or concrete poetry or language?
All right, so you're talking about the text works, but just when you began, you were talking about clinical. There's a word about the shelf, about the structure, and then before that, I heard the word erratic. So they are erratic and clinical. I mean, this is what's interesting, the different angles from which the discussion enters these works. But now I'm going to jump over to the text works. And language, of course, and linguistics. We come from the visual world. I think that when we enter the field of art, I'm talking about myself as an artist, and I'm assuming that it's the same with other artists. I think when we enter the art world, or are drawn by the desire to explore that field, we are seduced, attracted, stimulated by the visual, and the visual is linguistic. Children are responding visually, also in terms of their senses and sound, to language before they speak, before they are indoctrinated with a language that's their language, their country's language, the language that defines what everything is. It's a glass, it's water, it's a table, it's wood, it's this and that. You see them play and move things around and arrange them. And when the child is born, we talk about when they begin to see in color. So at first they don't see in color. And then what is color? So this is language, just like language that's structured in words or in numbers. It's got its own complexity. And this is what interests us as artists, is to understand that language and to situate it. Now, let's talk about the language that we use to communicate generally, the written language, words, letters. So there's a typology of language that is very current in our culture, that has a great effect, and it is words that come in shorthand. They are axioms, allegorical, aphorismic, and so on. And they're short statements that we find as headings for articles in the magazine, as wordings for a product, for generating and selling a product. But all these people who organize those short texts design them. They're called graphic designers, they're called ad copyists, and so on. So there's a whole language of play between the form of the letters, the typeset, or as they're called them, typeface. How interesting. Faces of people are not all the same, but we all have two eyes and a nose and a mouth and hair. So the words have different typefaces. What fascinates me is how those decisions are made to choose a certain typeface for a certain sentence. And these things run through all our media, and I say, stop. Let's see if there's one that I like more than the other. Is it because of the form of the typeface, or is it because of the content of the message, or is it because of the combination? And how does these messages work? So now these are pervasive messages, and they are objects. So if you ask me what I do collect, like maybe you collect stamps or coins, or maybe you collect stocks or other things, or impressionist paintings only, you know, if you can afford them, or you're into contemporary, whatever it is that you choose to collect, I collect these statements. When I see one that strikes my eye, I don't ask myself right away, why does it strike my eye or what? I say, that's interesting, and I take the page of the magazine, or I take a photograph of the statements in the book if I don't want to tear the page, you know, and I save that image word, and then I select from those ones that interest me at a certain point in time, and then I can make them into wall text. So they're put on the wall, and they could be blown up big or small. It's an original found object. I don't change the typeface or the message. So for instance, All Is Fair in Love downstairs was actually in the Sunday magazine of the New York Times, heading of an article, exactly in the same typeface, in the same organization. And something struck me about it, and I saved it, and eventually it became an art object, if you want to call it, because I am an artist, and I make art objects. Now, I know that Duchamp did not make art objects. That's what he told you, you know? But he was a very aesthetic person, as far as I'm concerned.
So I'm going to go off tangentially again, but I want to ask you about skins. And I think, for me, a lot of your work sets up a very specific surface temperature. Things look undeniably good. The shelves and the paintings sort of do this in a very different way, but with the collages, with these paintings in here, there is a very specific flatness to them. So I think about it in a way as a series of laminations of one thing on top of another, creating a very flat, almost graphic plane. And then in the shelf works, you're doing this in a similar way, in the sense that setting up these modular blocks of color on top of a shelf, which is a sort of universal surface, a lateral surface for placing things, for the objects. So in a similar way to the paintings, they're a kind of laminated or totalized object that has a very specific skin or a very specific point of penetration. So they're kind of closed objects. And then one of the most prominent things in this exhibition are the walls that you've built. And the walls, for me, are the one thing that sort of sets this idea of skins or a totalized surface into paradox, because the walls are unfinished. They have seams, they're plastered, they're not painted. But equally, again, back to this idea of hierarchies, there are still artworks hung on them. So they are the background, they are a context for these artworks to come to life, to be exhibited, to whatever. So I guess this question is why are the walls left unfinished? Why do we see the bones of them? What is the sense of, I mean, is it a specific sort of institutional critique in which the very location of the museum, of this art context, is drawn very much into focus, or is it a way of collapsing that? And you spoke at the beginning about the museum with walls, and in a sense this is almost a museum without walls, because it's like the binaries of what has cultural worth, what has a cultural capital, is almost deflated. That we have the walls, the physical walls of the Kunsthalle, which are painted white, but then your sculptural walls, which sort of intervene as parasites amongst these.
Thanks, Helen. Again, you hit the nail on the head, skins. For me, it's always been very philosophical, and by the time I was making the wedge-shaped shelves, that idea, I had to somehow refer to it, and getting back to the fact that one side of the shelf is not finished, or some part of the side of the shelf is not finished, it shows you how the plastic laminate is a skin that's put on top. When I began making these works, on occasion somebody would say to me, yeah, but why didn't you close the other side? Because it just felt uncomfortable that it was exposed, in a sense. That relates back to the walls. You know, my work comes out of a range of issues and questions that, again, go back to the 60s. Material. For Judd, specific objects were, among other things, specific materials. Because traditionally, art is made of paint or of bronze or of marble. For it to be art, that was the material, or clay, that was the material. But what if it is raw steel that then gets rusted with the weather? Well, it changes, and it's kind of rough, and it's kind of, yeah, not domestic or something. And then, well, why not? So then Richard Serra does his work not in bronze, and it's not finished or patinated. It is just the raw steel, and it changes with the weather and so on. So, surface. Things have surfaces. We project that they are three-dimensional or two-dimensional, whatever those surfaces are. But, you know, when the tree falls in the storm and the bark breaks, you see what's under that surface. When a majolica vase, that's a particular kind of traditional ceramic work, falls and breaks, you can see the white inside of the material inside that's under the surface of the glazing that's outside and the colors that are outside. So we see things with surface and we identify them for what they are. We have to identify that this transparent vase is actually physical, because otherwise we may just walk into it and it will fall, or we would hurt ourselves. So we have a language through which we understand what surfaces mean. And in that sense also it brings into the question of comfort. You use the word parasitical in a way, you know, because, you know, what does a parasite do? It eats the bark, and then you have holes from the worms, and then the whole tree falls. And it gets back also to the question of structure. So I'm going to go all the way back again to the 60s and 70s and specific materials. You begin to see the question of materiality. And then I jump back to what I'm doing now. The question of materiality has to do with the fragments, the pieces that are part of something that exposes the materiality. And so the idea of not finishing the wall has to do with art. You see, when the people who make the wall apply, you know, the cement to cover the seams, what we call in English spackle, it's a very pleasurable play of moving the squeegee, you know, and shifting it and doing it. It's like painting. It's like making art. There's a very pleasurable, I used to build walls, you know, feeling about it, but then we cover it with white to finish it. That's the finishing. But all the expression is already there. So here's what's happening. When I left walls unpainted at Bard at C.C. Hessel, they just had a lot of big lines all over the wall, because that's the way the Americans put this thing, you know. In London, it was a different pattern. And here, they were very careful, and there was a little mark over every place where there was a nail. And I was like, ooh, this doesn't look good, because I got too accustomed to the aesthetic feeling of the American way of doing it. I said, do I want to keep it unfinished? And I go, it's weird. Do I cover this or not? And then I said to myself, stupid, I mean, you're contradicting your whole philosophy. They're doing it. You let them do it. That's the way they do it here. Just accept it, you know? And then I said to Beatrix, well, what do you make of this pattern? And she said, oh, that's Toroni. And I said, great, okay.
Then we'll take some questions from the audience, if there are any. We're going to talk about Swiss walls. How good they are. There's a lady here. Yeah.
Hello. Maybe I will speak. If to see your works as clues to different worlds, I wanted to ask, have you ever done clues that don't have equivalent in a physical reality, or maybe to worlds that doesn't exist? It's a normal question. I mean worlds, some social, aesthetical worlds, your personal experiences with interiors, with, as I understood, it's really connected with your biography sometimes. Just like maybe it looks like this, maybe you live somewhere and saw something. And I wanted to ask if some your works aren't connected to physical reality and to your personal experience. I mean, did you ever, my English is not so good. Have you ever done some clues to worlds that doesn't exist?
Absolutely. How is it that that doesn't come across? Maybe I'm talking too much in terms of ideas, I don't know. Or maybe I'm being asked too many questions in terms of ideas. But that's a valid question. The biographical relationship to what we do, your personal history, your feelings, how you feel about things, your culture. Yeah, I have a personal history too, and a direct relationship with things and objects, and that's where it's coming from. But as I said, you know, the visual, the sensory, if you go that way and choose the road to the visual world and the cultural, historical, visual expression field and art, ultimately, what we call art, I think we are all connected to that. That was my point about Duchamp, you know. He could talk about being indifferent and removed, you know. And I think that's great that he did, because it's right. In a way, you have that distance. If you're a scientist or a philosopher or a poet or an artist, you have to be able to step also outside of your shoes and to have a perspective on yourself. But my relationship to the world and objects, I mean, I have feelings about these objects. I have to deal with my own conflicted feelings sometimes. I still find myself being prejudiced and saying, this is beautiful, but that is not. I stop myself and say, why am I saying that is not beautiful? Maybe it's beautiful to somebody else. Who would that be? Why? How would they feel about it? What culture is it? So in a way, maybe what you hear is a side of my work or thinking or my effort to put myself in somebody else's shoes and remove myself from myself and become indifferent, and then say, can I re-enter this thing that is talking to me from another point of view, from another person, from somebody who made it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my effort to answer it.
Okay. Another question? No? Beatrix?
Following on from the biographical question, I'm wondering whether there is anything object-wise that you feel so personally enamored by, so in love with, that you couldn't possibly sever your own personal relationship with it and use it in an artwork. Is there anything that you have kind of remaindered that you can't let go, that you can't give away?
Yes. But I try to give it away so that I can have a new experience. You know, there's a little stool, antique stool, but very simple and basic, that was once painted a color, but then it got old and some of the color paint came off and you see the color underneath. And I bought it from a friend who has an antique store, and I had it in the house. It was in my studio. And then I had a a son born. And then at a certain point, my boy River would use that as his little table when he was watching TV and eating his food. So he sat on his tiny stool, and the stool that I had that was only about a half a meter high, or even lower than that, he used as a table. Now, we have windows in the living room, and there's a latch that's high. In order to open the window, I have to reach that latch. So when I needed to reach that latch, I would take the stool and I would stand on it and I would open the latch of the window, and then it would go back on the floor, and then in the evening or afternoon, my son would use it as a table. So what happened is that he grew up and he didn't use it as a table anymore, and one day I put it in an artwork. I put it inside a box, like some that you see here, with a glass shelf, and it was sitting on the glass shelf, and on top of it, I put a replica that I bought at the museum of a Degas dancer. And so she's standing on top of that. And then I had a show, and it didn't sell. So after the show, I decided I'm going to keep it. But I never made a big statement that I'm keeping this. And meanwhile, there's an opportunity to show it at another place, at a museum, and then the museum decided to buy it. So I had to let it go. I wanted to keep this work of art because it's very personal. That chair has such a history. So that's maybe one example of that situation.
Maybe like, today, I don't know if it's Father's Day in Switzerland, but it certainly is in America. And I thought we might end with this question: how do your son's now 10, which is when children stop being inquisitive and start being critical. And how do you explain to your son River the value of what you do as an artist?
What was the first part of the question?
How do you explain to your son the value of what you do as an artist?
That was the last part of the question, but I'll answer that. Well, I think it's all explained. You can't control the explanation. Your child sees what you do. I work in the same place where we live. So my studio is my home, and even our living room is like my studio. There's one big wall there, and I usually put a piece on it, and it's in front of the door to River's room. And so very often there'd be a shelf there with objects. What's interesting is that as he grew up, he never messed with the objects. He never touched them, he never moved them. But one day, when River, in his room, he has a counter, a long table against the wall, and on it he's got his toys and things like that. And so one day, I'm in the living room, and River says to me, I'm about to go into his room, and he says, stop, you can't come in. He was about 3 years old. He says, you can't come in. He points to his table, and he says, this is my table, and these are my objects, and you can't touch them. And I think that's how you learn.
All right. Thank you, Haim. Thank you, Helen.